Welcome to Tom Talks. Join me once a week right here on Tom Boley YouTube channel. We're going to break down all the latest and greatest walleye fishing tips, walleye fishing tricks, the absolute location where these fish are right now, and all the practical relevant information you want and need. Hooked up. And look at that, just gone. For all the information you want and need, stay tuned right here once a week, Tom Talks. What's going on, guys? We're back with another Tom Talks video. I appreciate you guys tuning in. Yeah, this is where it happens. If this is your first time watching this, if you're not sure what a Tom Talks even is, it's basically it's me talking about practical walleye fishing and multi-species information for as long as this runs. This is a lot of the content that doesn't fit into the other videos. It's a lot of, like I said, practical information pertaining to the bite right now, recent videos we've done, and maybe just a lot of questions that kind of come up, right? And it's a good opportunity to once a week kind of sit here and, like I said, talk about a lot of the stuff that doesn't fit into the other videos that you guys want to hear. So we're just going to dig right into it. And this week what we're going to be talking about is, number one, we're going to be talking about basically where fish are right now, what kind of transitions I'm seeing, what the walleyes are doing. It's obviously kind of like the middle of summer now. Dog days of summer bite is upon us, right? And that can be a good thing and both a bad thing, and we'll talk about that. And the other thing we're going to talk about is I recently fished a very tough bite, and basically the two different ways you can target fish when the bite is very tough, right? And a couple of reasons why the bite might be tough. If you're experiencing tough walleye fishing, that should be a great little several minute talk about kind of how you can tackle that situation. And then we're gonna get to some YouTube comments, some of the trendier YouTube comments that I kind of keep seeing popping up over and over. So let's dig right into it. Let's get down to the information. What did I even say the first thing was we were gonna talk about? Yeah, what are fish doing right now, right? And like I said, dog days of summer. We had a crazy warm-up trend in early July. Now it's kind of plateaued out. Water temps probably mid-70s or up, kind of depending on where you are. And fish are in their summer locations, right? And what does this mean? Well, on a lot of the lakes I fish, kind of a lot of lakes spread across northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. Basically what I'm seeing a lot of is fish definitely transitioning out to their main lake, deeper haunts, right? And we've seen a little bit of this through the last, I would say, month now. But for some reason this year, it seems like it's taken a very long time for fish to get deep. And what I mean by that is, you know, a lot of times we see the same progression where, you know, spring's obviously a shallow water month. Early summer, you start to see that transition a little bit where those fish slide a little bit deeper. Generally, that midsummer period is a lot of what I'm doing is fishing a lot of deep structure, a lot of structure 20 to like 25, 27 feet of water, and a lot of hard bottom stuff, a lot of rock humps, hard bottom sand humps out there. And a lot of these pieces of structure are surrounded by like the deepest portion of the basin in that lake, right? And, you know, let's say you're fishing like a very flowagey system, right? Or a reservoir type system. You know, in the spring, a lot of times those fish start up by some kind of inflow, some kind of, you know, shallower north portion of that lake. Kind of as the summer moves on, they slowly push their way out into that bigger section of water, right? With that generally has a lot of deep water. And whether you're fishing for fish that are deep, in between, or shallow, one thing's always kind of the same with the summer is that a lot of times these spots are surrounded by very large sections of very deep water, right? Day to day where those fish might be, depth-wise might change a little bit, but it's generally those big portions of water where fish spend most of their time in the middle of summer. Then a lot of times in the fall they might kind of cinch back up, but so what I'm seeing right now depth-wise is, you know, for the month of July, we did a lot of open water fishing, trolling with spinners and stuff like that. We also did quite a bit of hyper rattling, and a lot of those fish we were targeting were in that, I would say 14 to like 20 foot zone, right? And that's kind of like that little bit shallower end of the deep water spectrum in a lot of the lakes I fish, right? And this stuff might change. You know, if you fish a lake that only gets 20 feet deep, maybe a lot of the spring those fish are in 3, 4, 5 feet. And then in the, you know, early summer time frame, maybe a lot of those fish are in 10 on a weed edge. Then maybe in the summer they're out in that 20-foot stuff, right? So depth and, you know, me talking about very deep, very shallow, all that stuff's kind of relative for the most part. But the what fish do pretty much stays the same almost no matter what you do or where you go. And kind of what we're seeing a lot right now is these fish just now kind of getting set up on a lot of this 23, 24, 26 foot stuff. And that, you know, is generally what happens on a lot of lakes I fish in the middle of summer, right? And a lot of these spots are rock. And I love fishing these kind of spots. You can be dealing with finicky fish sometimes because it is the middle of summer, but think about it this way, right? Deep fish and shallow fish, what would you rather fish for, right? Shallow fishing to me is probably more fun, but deep water fishing, it is much easier to get your bait in front of a lot of fish at one time in a lot of scenarios. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're fishing a big 5-foot flat, right? Well, most of the time there's not 20 walleyes stacked up in a boat width of space, right? When you're fishing shallow water. Now, like let's say you're fishing deep water, and most of the time what you have up shallow is those fish, all those 20 fish scattered around a larger flat, or a 20, 30, 40, 50 yard stretch of water, or 100 yard stretch of water a lot of times, right? And when you're fishing deep water, what you have happen a lot is, even if you have a really big spot or a really small spot, a lot of times there's like, let's say you have a really big rock bar or a really big sandbar that's all like 25 feet deep, right? And the walleyes use it. Most of the time what you have happen is those fish will kind of group up and they'll kind of relate together. And instead of scattering around a larger flat, a lot of times what happens is they'll all be very close together and they'll kind of start stacking like vertically almost, right? Something that looks closer to like this right here. And that stuff just doesn't happen in the spring. You don't have that many fish jam-packed right next to each other. And basically what that means is that you can do some kind of presentation, that's a jig, a slip bob, or a Lindy rig, whatever you want to do, and you can put that bait in front of a lot of fish at one point, right? And that's always a bonus whenever you're fishing, right? The goal is to always put your bait in front of as many fish as possible in the shortest period of time, right? That generally leads to more bites and more fish caught, right? It's really that simple. And that's kind of what dictates, some days whether you're going to jig, cast, troll, whatever you're going to do, how those fish are set up really dictates that a lot of times. And when those deep water fish finally start hitting a lot of this deeper rock, and rock's probably one of the most talked about deep water things in the summer because it's just a walleye magnet. It's really an everything magnet. Smallmouth love it in the summer, but fishing rocks for walleyes in deep water in the middle of summer is obviously nothing new. But what you have happen is, like I said, all those fish will clump up generally in a school or around a notable piece of structure on that spot. If you have a really big gravel flat and there's two big boulders on this corner right on top and 23 feet, that's a lot of times a sweet spot where those fish kind of group up, right? Great presentations to do this, like we said, is anything with a spinning rod where you can get in front of a lot of fish at one time. Now, the reason these fish are going deeper is generally because, we had that super crazy warm up in early July, and what that happened, it just super heated like the top several feet of the water. And then the first day we had wind, the water temps just dropped like a rock, like 8-10 degrees. And that was just it dispersing all that surface water and kind of distributing it throughout the cooler, lower water, right? And now what you have happening is that heat keep penetrating. It's middle of summer, and those fish keep pushing deeper, right? The same thing that happens pretty much on every lake throughout walleye country, really anywhere, every single year, right? And that's the reason we're starting to see these fish go deep. And really what they kind of do is they kind of keep, they'll always kind of be fish in this deeper water, generally until turnover. And then something kind of weird starts to happen, right? When that water starts to cool again, early September, mid-September, late September, early October, kind of depending on where you're at, then you see another shuffling of fish. But one great part about summer, which is true for really any species, is that the patterns generally stay the same for the longest period of time, right? If you're finding a lot of fish in 24 feet of water, generally those fish are going to be related to 24 feet of water from now until the water cools down again, right? And it's like musky fishing, right? Musky fishing is the needle in a haystack style of fishing where you're trying to create a pattern off of anything. And it only takes a couple, 2 or 3 or 4 fish to create a pattern when you're musky fishing. You don't even have to catch them, you can just see them. And one of the reasons musky guys like summer so much is because those patterns stay the same for the longest period of time, more than any other time of year. Spring's very volatile, fall's very volatile, turnover period's very volatile in early fall. Summer, fish stay in the same place generally for a very long time. And that's a good thing if you're a fisherman, right? And yeah, that's kind of what I'm seeing. Now, is there going to be fish in weeds still? Yes, weeds are one piece of structure that definitely hold fish shallow. Now, if you're on a massive system like a Great Lake or something like that, wind's another thing that could bring fish shallow. And especially if you have, in the summer, I talk a lot about it in videos, but if you have a very good wind in the summer blowing into a very big weed edge, generally a weed edge that kind of flattens out and kind of goes out to the basin, that's a great spot to be walleye fishing. And a lot of times if you can find those fish up shallower, they're much more bitey. And this kind of leads me into the next thing we're talking about, which is the very tough bite that I was experiencing. Maybe a lot of you guys were too. Not so much the last few days here, but kind of the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, intermittently, the bite would get very tough. And that's one reason we did a lot of structure, or a lot of open water trolling. And I'll talk about that right now. A lot of times what you have happen in the middle of summer, these dog days of summer, is a lot of these deep water spots sees very finicky fish. And I don't know why that is, but it kind of happens everywhere, right? You might have a deep water spot that's just loaded with walleyes every day, right? And they might be very difficult to catch. I don't know why these deeper water fish are more touchy. There'll be some days where they just fire off and you have phenomenal days, right? And that's all what we hope happens for the next week or 2 weeks, or intermittently throughout the rest of the summer, obviously. But the reality is that these bites do get very finicky when you're fishing deep water fish. So when confronting a tough bite like this, and you're on a number of fish that are just not eating out in this deeper water, which a lot of times is the pattern, the most prevalent pattern, based on location. It's, there's a lot of fish out deep, and there's a few fish kind of still shallow, and there's a few fish out suspended over open water, right? Well, we obviously all want to fish for the most fish at the same time, so a lot of times those deep water fish is what attracts all of us in the summer. But the reality is that if that bite gets tough, the first thing I'll do is go try to find fish on something that is not what I was just finding them on. Like those big weed edges, right? Big weed edges, or maybe you're fishing a stain system where those fish might be up in the weeds in the summer too. And generally, if you can find those shallow water fish, like I was saying, they're almost always a little bit easier to catch, or they're almost always a little more active. I don't know why that is. It just seems to be the case over and over, year after year, anywhere you kind of go type of deal, right? Those shallow water fish in the middle of summer, especially if you add some wind, are generally a little bit easier to catch, in my opinion. There might not be as many of them up there, which might make them tougher to catch, but they are generally a little bit more active. So, and then the open water thing, that's the other thing you can do, is if those deep fish aren't biting and you're not finding anything on the weeds, check the open water. Everywhere pretty much has an open water suspended walleye bite in the summer, whether you fish a very stained system or a very deep clear system, right? A lot of those stained systems, that's relying off of a lot of your like panfish and perch forage that'll hang out over a lot of that soft bottom area. And in your clear water systems, perch are still a player, but it's bug hatches and then getting all that Cisco and kind of like that deep water bait up in the water column, and the walleyes will relate to that stuff. And a lot of a very simple way, and I know we filmed some stuff on this, a very simple way to think about open water walleyes is imagine, if you drive around the lake on structure and you're seeing fish everywhere in 20 feet of water and you're just not getting bit, the best thing you can do is fish 20 feet down, or pretend the fish are 20 feet down and you want to be catching them out off that structure, right? So if I'm fishing for fish that are 20 feet down on a rock bar, I probably want to be putting my bait, 15 feet down or 17 feet down, somewhere right in that zone. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to troll that 15 to 17, 18 foot depth zones for those fish that are probably a few feet down below that, right? Crankbait, spinner rigs, those are kind of the two things that, we're trolling the most of. And yeah, and you're just raking water. Get just outside of the biggest piece of structure on that lake, or the most complex area that's got, 10 humps and points and weed edges all kind of in a relatively mile long vicinity. Get just outside of that stuff and 30, 40, 50, 60 feet, kind of wherever it tapers out and falls into the basin, and just start raking water, because there's almost always walleyes out in those areas in the summer. And a lot of times, these are the most difficult fish to find, because it's never a really impressive look at the graph, right? It's never like, oh, look at this pot of 20 fish over open water. And that doesn't happen on inland lakes. If you're fishing the Great Lakes, it might happen, right? But that doesn't happen on inland lakes for the most part. For the most part, it's like, oh, there's one. You drive 20, 30 more yards. Oh, there's a fish. And, stuff like that. It's never really like an impressive view. So it's very hard to just drive these areas and say like, yep, we need to start trolling here. A lot of times just kind of do it, see what happens, and then, make up your mind there. So, but a lot of times open water fish are generally the most aggressive fish in a lake. And a lot of times in the summer, it's your biggest bites in the lake are those fish that hang out over basin in the summer. And we see it a lot around here. I've never caught a 30-inch inland walleye in Wisconsin. Lots of them in Green Bay and in the Great Lakes. But big fish in my area is kind of when you start hitting that 24-inch mark. Anything bigger than that is a big one where I fish, right? And these are a lot of times the fish we're catching out over open water. It's not uncommon at all to fish a whole day, have a great day walleye fishing, maybe catch 20, 30 fish, and have like 2 or 3 that you can actually are in that eater size slot, right? And a lot of times that's why I like fishing that bite so much, is because it's so keyed on big fish. But getting back to the main point, what we're talking about is, what you can do in a tough bite when you find these finicky fish out deep. And I just did a video kind of on how I like to confront a tough bite. And there's really a couple different things. I can't put everything in these videos. It's just kind of too much informational overload. And then, and then every video would just be like this. It'd just be me sitting here for 20 minutes talking to you guys. But in that video I just did recently, basically one thing you can do when fishing gets tough and you can find fish is fish very simply. Your Lindy rigs, your slip bobbers, your jig and live bait. All three of those things are very keyed off live bait, right? It might be a crawler, might be a leech, might be a minnow. But going fishing very deliberately, very methodically, putting that bait in front of fish a lot with something you know has a very high likelihood of being in front of that fish and them not shying away from it, right? If you drag a leech on a Lindy rig through fish, they're not spooked by it. It's very natural, it's very slow, it's very floaty, very wispy, and those are the kind of things that when a bite gets tough is a great option to try, right? The other one, which I have filmed this year as well, is like very fast, very snappy, very erratic baits. Your Acme Hyper Rattles, your Kalen's, snap jigging like a Kalen's jerk minnow or a swim bait. Something very fast and very snappy. Now, these are phenomenal baits to fish when fish are both very amped up, and sometimes they're very good baits to fish when fish are very negative or neutral, because you're looking for that instantaneous reaction bite, right? Fishing does not have a yes answer or a no answer, right? It's just you got to go out and play with it. There's no for sure's or no rules to any of it. But these are normally the two things I try, right? And that speed jigging style of fishing, your hyper rattles, your jigging wraps, your shiver minnow, stuff like that. Basically what this stuff is it's making a fish make an instantaneous reaction, right? It's in front of them, they see it, they're either biting it or they're getting out of the way, right? Now, the one thing these kind of baits do to fish is what I just said. It's either bite it or get out of the way presentations, right? Your speed jigging stuff, your snap jigging stuff, a lot of times you can push fish around with this stuff, right? You might be able to Lindy rig or jig a leech or a crawler or a minnow through fish 100 times, and then on the 100th try he bites it, right? It doesn't really work like that with those speed jig things. A lot of times, like I said, those fish latch on, they bite it right away, or it's kind of it's not like throwing it 100 more times really makes a difference. A lot of times what you see is you end up pressuring fish off that spot in a very short period of time fishing these baits. Phenomenal ways to catch walleyes, yes, incredibly productive, and you guys have seen me fish these baits a ton with a lot of success. But normally if you're seeing a lot of that, you're seeing a lot of you pushing fish off spots, or just dropping, baits, fishing for 10 minutes, going back and seeing the fish aren't there and you didn't catch any, then it's time to go with a very simple, very light, very floaty live bait presentation, which is generally something with a weight, something with a hook, and something with a crawler or a leech in the middle of summer, right? So those are kind of the two ways I like to target a tough bite. Now, the reason a bite can be tough is one, you're finding them and not catching them, or two, you're not finding them at all, right? And that's kind of the way I like to think of a tough bite. And the way the bite was tough for me last week was I was finding them and not catching them, right? I could cast at them over and over and over and just couldn't bite. I don't really care why it wasn't a good bite, as far as what variable caused them to be like that. Doesn't really matter, right? But the reason, the ultimate result was that you basically just had to sit on them and make 100 casts to those fish with something very live bait oriented to get bit, right? Or you could go around pot of fish to pot of fish to pot of fish and try to pick off a fish out of each school with a speed jig lure like a hyper rattle. All right, so next thing, that kind of wrapped up the tough bite I was having. Now, this is what you see a lot in the summer, is these tough bites just swinging in and out, right? It might be super good for a few days, kind of weather-based, and then it might be, super slow for a day, weather-based or bug hatch-based, or who even knows, right? I think the reason it was so tough last week for me was because it was just like front after front after front after front after front. And a lot of times, a barometric shift is always good, I think. As long as it's preceded by like stable weather, right? A lot of times when you see these fronts that are just all over the place, right? You might wake up on that day and be like, oh, good overcast, good south wind, front coming in, today's gonna be a good day, then it sucks. A lot of times it has to do with the fact that there was 14 fronts in the previous 36 hours before that, right? Which, if you're anywhere you live around me, you probably know that's kind of how it's been. A lot of these small thunderstorms popping up just every day throughout the course of a day for like weeks on end, it seems like, right? And I think that was probably why it was tough. But moving on, we're gonna get to some of your guys' questions, YouTube questions, kind of some of the common stuff I see asked. And here we go. First one, are suspended walleyes, are suspended eyes in the water column relating to thermocline deep structure on slick calm days? And so this is a good question. and it's one we see a lot, which is why I picked all these questions to be asked, right? So when you find walleyes in the open water, what are they actually relating to, right? Well, a lot of the stuff is, it's kind of a mixture of all these things. So what the thermocline does, if you're not sure, it's the mix between the warmer surface water and the cooler down below water. And in the late fall, it flips over, and then everything's kind of muted out in the same. And then in the early spring, you know, it starts to set up in that mid-spring, early summer time frame, right? And this is a lot of times right when we start seeing walleyes start to suspend, is in that early summer period for the most part, right? And what the thermocline does is a lot of lakes, it'll set up like 20, 22 feet down in the early summer period, and it'll just keep driving down deeper until like that early fall, that very early fall period. So we might see that thing set up at 20 feet down, and then by the late summer, it might be like 30 feet down, 32 feet down, right? For example. So, and basically what that means is, although yes, some fish will go down below that thermocline, it's not like a super high numbers thing down there, right? And a lot of times it's too great of a depth to even want to fish for the walleyes because they will die on the way up. But basically what this does, it's a wall, right? It's kind of a wall in the water column. So a lot of our spots, and it kind of follows the seasonal progression of walleyes. A lot of our, let's say, fish are relating to a rock bar. Well, in early June, they might be in 13 feet. That thermocline pushes deeper in the middle of summer down to 28. Those walleyes might be in 25, 26 feet on that thermocline right now, right? So it's kind of a box, right? And getting to the structure part here, do walleyes relate to thermocline or deep structure? It's kind of both, right? Because if those fish are relating to rock bars, let's say in the middle of summer in 27 feet, that thermocline's in 30 feet, right? And then those fish slide out to the basin. It's not like any fish just permanently probably lives in the basin. They can kind of do the swing where they probably come in and out for who knows what reason or why, right? But that thermocline kind of dictates the depth at which those fish are going to be at. And that structure gives those fish a place to kind of pull into, or, you know, a great fish holding zone, right? If they're not out in the open water. So that's kind of the way I like to think about a lot of that suspended location. And it kind of has to do with both. The thermocline doesn't really mean quite as much as probably it is talked about, because it's just kind of a natural progression of fish movement, right? Generally spring shallow, fish go out deeper in the middle of summer, and then some fish will come back up shallow in the fall once that thermocline dissolves. So don't get too caught up on trying to find a thermocline, but put a ton of importance on trying to find the depth in which fish are relating to, right? Can you see a thermocline on a graph? Yes, if it's a very hard setup, you will definitely see it on the graph, and generally it'll just be like a kind of a hard dark line, and then it'll be fuzzier down below that for the most part. And then the third part of this question, I guess, is on slick calm days, right? And basically what these slick calm days do to fish is it doesn't lock them up on something for the most part, and it's kind of hard to describe unless you have the experience of doing it and seeing it a lot. But basically what slick calm does, fish generally have a little bit more of a tendency to roam when it's just a slick calm day out, right? If you have a big wind coming into a piece of structure, a lot of times it brings fish up to that edge and centers them up in, you know, maybe a spot where they've been feeding for years and years on end, right? Those little sweet spots, right? But without the wind, generally what you'll see is, even if there are still fish on that weed edge, they might be more spread out, right? They might be more spread out and kind of roaming around, because there's nothing really like, you know, that wind a lot of times brings life into structure, especially shallow structure. But basically, slick calm days, the reason trolling is generally the best option on a lot of those days is because fish's attitude on structure is very poor, and a lot of them start to roam, and then they end up out over the basin. So when you have a lot of fish out over the basin roaming around and not locked down to structure, on top of that, the structure bite is generally very poor, because fish don't have a very good attitude on those slick calm days. A lot of times it makes those open water fish definitely the ones to go after on those flat, calm, hot summer days. So that was kind of the long answer for that question, but hopefully that gave you some insight on how kind of I attack those kind of situations. Now for the next question here. Hi Tom, I've heard several walleye guys mention wind when talking about walleye fishing. Can you do a video? Wow, we just kind of answered this question. Can you do a video explaining how wind affects walleye fishing? How does wind factor into location, fishing techniques? Does wind direction matter? Blah, 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 blah. I've heard wind mentioned but never explained. So basically, how does wind affect walleye fishing, and do wind directions matter and stuff like that? And there, like, once again, we kind of got into a little bit on the last question, but there's no like definite yes or no answers to any of this stuff, right? But a lot of what I see, you know, especially talking about shallow water structures, is wind plays a huge deal in both pulling fish onto that structure number one, and number two, making them more active, right? If you have a big wind coming into a big piece of structure that's generally, you know, less than that 20-foot zone, it generally makes those fish more active, right? And generally puts more fish on that spot. That's a good situation to be fishing. Now, wind direction, I would much rather have wind coming into a spot than I would coming off of a spot, for the most part, right? And the reason for that is the same thing. You know, if you have a wind blowing out from a spot, then the wind's just kind of pushing out to basin, right? If you have a wind coming into spot, a lot of times it'll start stacking perch up there. It pushes a lot of bug life in there, which might be why the perch are there. And you just kind of have this, you know, it just feels right. That's really the only way I can describe it. You know, there's a lot of little stuff going on, which obviously I don't even care to pay attention to because it's too little to even really matter for me. But that's a lot of what I see. Now, as far as wind direction goes, I also, you know, you always feel like the east wind's a bad thing. I've had plenty of good fishing in east winds. Generally what east winds mean is that it's very volatile weather, right? Generally you don't have east wind for like several days without a lot of fronts going through or a major pressure change or something like that. And a lot of times you'll see an east wind very post-frontal, making it difficult to catch fish just because it's post the backside of a huge front or something like that. So don't get too caught up in a lot of those little things, wind direction. You kind of heard me talk about, you know, like the way fish suspend if it's flat. But if you can, you know, especially if you're fishing structure-oriented fish, and you can get on a big spot that has wind coming into it, I always feel better about that anyways. Now, the flip side of that is if you're someone who fishes like a really big lake that has, you know, vastly cooler temperatures over here, like let's say Green Bay, for example, or, you know, a lot of these style of very big fisheries, wind is a huge thing for those fish, right? It might control water color. You know, a lot of times wind will cause dirtier water, and a lot of times if it's in a very clear system, those fish like grouping up in dirtier water. Number two, it'll control temperature a lot of times. You know, if you have, you know, a very big wind and, you know, it starts blowing out to the colder water, a lot of times you'll see cooler water come in on the back side of it and cool stuff down. So on those very big systems, there's a lot of different stuff going on in that kind of stuff. You might be looking for, you know, warm water in the spring, and then in the summer time frame, you might be looking for cooler water, right? It kind of all depends. Every single lake's different. Those big lakes are generally very wind-driven lakes, and especially if they're big and shallow. A lot of those lakes are very wind-driven lakes. Big, shallow, and clear, even more so, right? But, you know, don't think too much into that. I always like to think of where fish are and how should I fish for them, more so than, oh, you know, trying to think about all the little variables going on in a fish's brain and, you know, try to make a decision from there. But wind definitely does affect fish. You guys just heard me mention some of the things I noticed, so hopefully that was helpful to you guys. I think we got one more question. All right. Tom, you always suggest heavy sinkers, but everything I've heard in the past seems to be talking about the lightest sinker and terminal tackle you can fish, so the fish don't feel resistance. And can you go more into depth on this? And this is a good one too, right? And it kind of goes a couple of different ways. Light presentations are great when you're trying to do that very finessey, very live baity thing, which is a lot of times what we're trying to do, like in the springtime, right? If we're fishing like a lot of jig and minnow stuff, we're generally trying to go to like an eighth ounce jig, maybe something even a little bit lighter depending how deep we're fishing, and make it very natural looking going through an area. And another thing might be like lindy rigging, for example, right? Generally what you're trying to do when you're lindy rigging is fish something very natural and very floaty. Now on the flip side of that, talking about heavy fishing, like my slip bobber videos, when I put a 1/4 ounce weight here and then another 1/4 ounce weight on the end of my slip bobber, so I'm fishing a 1/2 ounce of lead on the slip bobber, you know, throughout it, and trying to make it very fast. Now the point of that is to get in front of fish very quickly in deep water, right? And it's basically an efficiency game. If I see fish, I want to drop and be in them immediately. What I don't want to do is drop something very light, very floaty, and have it, you know, get blown all around and moved all around, and eventually it gets down to the fish and it's kind of floating away like that, right? So that's one instance where I use a lot of weight. The other one would be like snap jigging, where you're trying to do something very fast. You know, let's say you're fishing 15 feet of water, and you can fish a 1/4 ounce there on a snap jig, but going to a 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce creates that very snap, very fast, very active presentation, right? And you know, so there's always kind of a couple different ways to look at it. The other way is like the hyper rattle. This is the extreme version of weight. That bait would not be very productive if it weighed a 1/4 ounce, and the reason for that is it'd take you a long time to get down to them. It'd basically just be like working a normal jig at that point, right? The reason that 1 ounce bait is so productive, well, first of all, it has just a crazy side to side all over erratic action, but it's very heavy, which makes it very fast. It's that split second reaction. It's very efficient to fish. You could fish, deep water very quickly. You can get it in front of fish very quickly, and it's very fast in those depths, right? It's a very fast way to fish, and it makes that fish make a split second decision to either jump on it or not. So, talking about weight on a presentation. All right, we had the camera randomly stop there. That was bizarre. I must be talking way too long. But talking about weight, those are kind of the two ways I'd look at it. It's either you want to get down to those fish very quickly and fish very fast, or you want to get down to those fish eventually, fish very methodically, very slow, very floaty, and something that looks very natural. So both things obviously work. It's kind of experimenting day to day and fishing both. So we actually kind of wrapped this up nicely, talking about almost all three things kind of linked together. I didn't even plan that, but that was nice. So I appreciate you guys asking the questions. I appreciate you guys watching this video. I know it kind of got kind of long. Also, I want to say thank you to everybody who bought a shirt. I really appreciate that. I never thought that I would be a guy who'd have a t-shirt, but I greatly appreciate that. If you want to buy it, I'll link it down below this video. It's also in the banner of this video. And yeah, stay tuned for the next video. I'm loading up. I actually experienced 2 horrible days of trying to catch a salmon. It was fun to be out salmon fishing, but I don't know anything about salmon fishing, and I don't think the fish were biting very good. So I'll try it again later this summer. But back to walleyes now. I'm gonna go catch some fish. Tomorrow we're leaving on another adventure, so I appreciate you guys watching. I got a lot of stuff to do. Stay tuned. We'll see you guys next time.